You ever walk past someone and realize too late they were the reason your life didn't fall apart? The rain came down in thin, steady lines, tapping softly against the black surface of William Carter's SUV as the door opened with a muted click, warm air spilling out into the cold night, his polished leather shoes meeting the wet pavement with quiet precision before he stopped, just a few feet ahead, something in the shadows catching his attention, a shape curled near the edge of the sidewalk beneath a flickering streetlight. Barely noticeable unless you looked twice, and he almost didn't. Almost stepped right past her like everyone else had, until a small plastic badge slipped from her hand and skidded across the concrete, tapping once against the toe of his shoe, and that sound, soft as it was, seemed to echo louder than it should have, freezing him in place as he bent slightly, eyes narrowing, the glow of the streetlight reflecting off the laminated surface, revealing a name he hadn't expected to see outside his own walls. Ava Johnson, facility staff, Carter Holdings, his company, his building, his employee, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to that single detail, the cold air pressing against his skin, the distant hum of traffic fading into something indistinct, because suddenly the image in front of him didn't match the one in his mind, not the quiet woman who moved through his penthouse in the early mornings, wiping down glass surfaces that never seemed to stay clean. Adjusting things he never noticed were out of place, always invisible, always silent, and yet here she was, curled on the ground, her coat too thin for the weather, her breath faint in the chilled air, her fingers slightly curled as if still holding on to something that was no longer there, and something about that didn't sit right, not with the order he expected from the world, not with the clean lines of control he built his life around, because in his world, people like her didn't exist outside the roles he assigned them, they didn't spill into the streets, didn't blur into the edges of the city where things were uncertain and unresolved, and yet this was real, unfiltered, undeniable, and it unsettled him in a way he couldn't immediately explain, so he straightened, the badge still in his hand, the weight of it somehow heavier than it should be, his jaw tightening slightly as he glanced back toward the towering glass building behind him, lights still glowing from the upper floors where deals were made and decisions shaped entire futures, and then back to her, lying just a few feet away from it all, as if the distance between those two worlds was only a matter of steps, not circumstances, and for the first time that night, William Carter didn't move forward, didn't walk away, didn't pretend he hadn't seen what was right in front of him, because something about this moment refused to be ignored, even if he didn't yet understand why. The next morning came too clean for what he had seen the night before, sunlight spilling across the glass walls of the penthouse in sharp, golden lines as if nothing in the world had shifted, but something had, even if he refused to name it, because as William Carter stood near the window overlooking the city, coffee untouched in his hand, his mind kept returning to the same image, the same stillness, the same quiet figure beneath that flickering streetlight, and it made everything around him feel slightly off, like a perfectly aligned room where one object had been moved just enough to disturb the balance. So he did what he always did when something felt out of place, he compartmentalized it, pushed it into order, reduced it to something simple, something solvable. Because that was how his world worked, problems had causes and causes had consequences, and people were expected to maintain control over their circumstances. That belief had built everything he had, and he was not about to question it now, not over one employee, not over one night. So by the time he stepped into the elevator, descending from the quiet height of his private floor down into the structured rhythm of his headquarters, his expression had settled back into its usual composure, sharp, unreadable, precise, the kind that left no room for uncertainty. And when the doors opened onto the executive level, the familiar sounds returned, the low hum of conversation, the distant clicking of keyboards, the soft echo of footsteps across polished marble, everything exactly where it should be, everything controlled, predictable, clean, and yet as he walked down the hallway, something pulled his attention to the side, just for a second. A reflection in the glass, a memory overlapping with reality, and there she was again, not on the street this time, but inside, standing near the far end of the corridor with a cleaning cart beside her, her movements quiet, deliberate, as if she had always been there, as if nothing had happened, as if the night had not existed at all, and that contradiction tightened something in his chest before he even realized it. Because she looked the same uniform, the same steady posture, the same way she kept her eyes lowered just enough to remain unnoticed. But now he knew something he had not known before. Now he could not unsee what he had seen, and it disrupted the narrative he had already constructed, so he stopped, just briefly, his voice cutting through the air with calm authority as he called her name, Ava, and she paused instantly, turning toward him with a slight nod, her expression composed, respectful, controlled in a way that mirrored his own, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to feel deliberate, as if both were measuring what would come next, and when he finally spoke, his tone carried that same quiet edge it always did, direct, efficient, untouched by emotion as he asked why she had not reported her situation, why she was outside instead of handling her responsibilities properly. Because in his mind there had to be a reason that fit within the structure he understood, something that explained it without breaking the rules he believed in, and she listened without interrupting, her hands resting lightly against the handle of the cart, her fingers still, her posture steady, and when he finished, she simply answered in a voice that was soft but clear, saying she did not want to cause trouble, that she was still able to do her job, that everything was under control, and something about that answer, about the simplicity of it. The refusal to ask for anything, to explain further, to shift the weight of the situation onto him, unsettled him more than anything else, because it did not fit the system he relied on, it did not give him a problem to solve, only a reality he did not fully understand, and instead of sitting with that discomfort, he did what he had always done, he drew a line, sharp and immediate, stating that this was unacceptable, that the company required stability, reliability, and that if she could not maintain those standards then she could not remain in her position, and the words landed with the same finality as any decision he had ever made, clean, definitive, controlled, and she nodded once, not in protest, not in shock, but in quiet acknowledgement. As if she had expected nothing else, and without another word she turned back to her cart, the wheels rolling softly across the floor as she continued down the hallway, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before, a silence that did not resolve, that did not settle, but lingered, just beneath the surface of everything he thought he understood. The rest of the day moved forward like nothing had happened, meetings stacked back to back, voices blending into a steady rhythm of projections, contracts, and numbers that climbed higher with every passing hour, yet none of it settled. The quiet tension that had begun to follow William Carter like a shadow just out of sight, because every time he paused, even for a second, it returned, that image, that moment, the way she had simply nodded and walked away without argument, without resistance, as if being dismissed from stability was just another thing to carry, and it did not make sense to him, not in the way things usually did. Because he had built his entire life on cause and effect, action and response, pressure and result. And yet there had been no pushback, no attempt to negotiate, no sign of desperation, only that same quiet composure, and that absence of reaction unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. So when the final meeting ended and the room emptied, leaving behind only the faint hum of the city filtering through the glass, he remained seated longer than usual, fingers resting against the edge of the table, eyes unfocused for just a moment before he stood abruptly, as if motion itself could restore order, and stepped out into a hallway, expecting the familiar calm to return, but instead there was a gap, subtle but unmistakable, because the cart that had been there earlier was gone, the faint scent of cleaning solution already fading, the small signs of her presence erased as efficiently as everything else she had ever touched, and that should have been the end of it, a completed action, a resolved decision, but it was not, because as he walked past the now spotless glass panels, he caught his reflection and something in it felt off, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough to hold his attention for a fraction longer than usual, and that was when his assistant approached, tablet in hand. Voice low and professional as she mentioned a financial report that required his signature, something routine, something expected. But as she scrolled through the document, one line stood out, not because of its size, but because of the name attached to it, Ava Johnson, and beneath it, a note, quietly listed among other expenses, a payment process to a charitable assistance fund connected to the company, a full amount cleared for a pediatric medical bill, and for a second, the words did not register fully. His mind attempting to place them within the structure he understood, until the connection formed, slow but undeniable, and the room seemed to shift in a way that was almost imperceptible, because this was not a request, not an appeal, not something brought to his attention for approval. It had already been done, already completed without recognition, without expectation, and as he looked closer, more details surfaced, timestamps, dates. A pattern of small contributions over weeks that had quietly built into something significant, something deliberate, and the realization settled in with a weight that felt different from anything earlier that day, because while he had reduced her situation to a lack of control, to a failure to meet standards, the reality in front of him did not fit that narrative at all. It contradicted it entirely, and for the first time, the structure he relied on did not provide an immediate answer, only a growing awareness that something fundamental had been overlooked. Something that could not be categorized or dismissed as easily as he had assumed, and as the assistant continued speaking, unaware of the shift taking place, William Carter did not respond right away, his gaze fixed on the name on the screen, the same name that had been printed on that badge the night before, the same name he had just removed from his company hours ago, and in that stillness, the silence returned, not empty this time, but heavy, filled with the quiet presence of a truth he had not yet fully faced, one that lingered just beneath the surface, waiting to be understood. The screen dimmed slightly as the tablet lowered, but the numbers did not leave his mind. They stayed there, sharp and immovable, like a detail that refused to blur no matter how many other priorities tried to take its place, and for the first time that day, William Carter did not move on to the next decision, did not shift focus, did not reduce the moment into something manageable, because this did not behave like a problem, it behaved like a contradiction, something that quietly unraveled the certainty he had been standing on, and as he turned away from the hallway and walked back toward his office, the silence around him felt different, heavier, as if the building itself carried an awareness he had only just begun to notice, the polished floors reflecting overhead lights in perfect symmetry, the glass walls still without a single mark, everything exactly as it should be, and yet none of it felt as precise as it had that morning, because now there was context behind it, unseen effort, unnoticed consistency, and he had removed the person responsible for it without hesitation, without question, and that realization did not come with a dramatic shift, it came quietly, settling in layers, each one harder to ignore than the last. So when he stepped inside his office and closed the door behind him, the soft click echoed longer than usual, his reflection appearing faintly in the glass panels that surrounded him, a version of himself that suddenly seemed more distant than before, and he stood there for a moment, not sitting, not reaching for the next file, just existing in that pause, allowing the thought he had avoided to finally take shape, because if she had chosen to spend her money on something that was not hers to fix, if she had given stability away in order to provide it to someone else, then the assumption he made earlier was not just incomplete, it was wrong, and that word, simple as it was, carried a weight he was not used to holding, not in this way, not without immediate correction, and yet correction required more than acknowledgement, it required action, something he had not yet decided how to take, so instead he moved, crossing the room toward his desk, placing both hands against its edge as he looked down, the city stretching out beyond the windows behind him, unaware of the shift happening within a single office high above it, and then, without calling for permission or announcement, he reached for the phone, his voice calm but edged with something new as he instructed his assistant to pull up all available information connected to Ava Johnson, employment records, contact details, anything that would tell him where she had gone after walking out of that building, because the absence of that answer had begun to feel less like a detail and more like a gap he could not leave unaddressed, and when the response came back, hesitant at first, stating that no forwarding address had been provided, that her file ended the moment her employment did, the silence returned again, but this time it carried urgency, not confusion, and he did not sit with it, did not allow it to settle. Instead he turned, already moving toward the door, his Steps measured but faster than before, the rhythm of control still present but no longer untouched, because for the first time that day, William Carter was not moving to maintain order, he was moving to find something he had let slip past him, something that now refused to remain invisible. And as the elevator doors closed in front of him, reflecting his still expression back at him, the city below continued as it always did, unaware that somewhere within it, a story he thought had ended was only just beginning to unfold. The elevator descended in silence, each passing floor marked by a soft chime that felt louder than it should have, counting down the distance between decision and consequence. And when the doors opened to the lobby, the air shifted, warmer, filled with the low murmur of conversations and the distant hum of the city pressing in through revolving doors, but none of it slowed him. Because the image in his mind had already moved ahead of him, placing her back under that same flickering streetlight, the same place where he had almost walked past her without seeing anything at all, and now that moment replayed differently, not as something distant, but as something immediate, unfinished, demanding a second look. So he stepped outside, the evening air carrying a sharper chill than before, the sky dimming into that muted gray that settles just before night fully takes over, and for a second he paused, scanning the sidewalk, the edges of the street, the spaces most people ignored, as if expecting to find everything exactly where he had left it. But the spot was empty, the concrete bare, the light still flickering but illuminating nothing except rain beginning to gather again in thin, scattered drops. And something about that absence landed heavier than the sight itself had, because now there was no confirmation, no certainty, only the realization that time had moved forward without him, that whatever chance he had to understand had already shifted out of reach, and he did not accept that, not this time. So he moved, stepping off the curb, his gaze sharper now, scanning further down the block, past the line of parked cars, toward the bus stop where a few figures stood waiting, shoulders hunched against the cold. And he approached without hesitation, his presence drawing brief glances but no recognition, because out here he was just another man in a coat, just another figure moving through the city, and for the first time in a long time, that anonymity did not feel like control, it felt like limitation, because he could not command answers here, could not summon information with a call or a signature. He had to ask, and that shift, subtle as it was, changed the weight of every step he took. So when he reached the bus stop, his voice came out steady but direct as he described her. The coat, the badge, the way she carried herself, and the responses came slowly, uncertain, a few head shakes, a brief pause, until one older man nodded slightly, recalling someone matching that description heading toward the north end of the street earlier, moving quickly, alone, and that small piece of direction was enough to keep him moving, enough to turn uncertainty into action. So he thanked the man with a brief nod and continued on, his pace steady but more urgent now, the city stretching out in front of him in a way that felt unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because his role within it had. And as he walked further from the bright entrances and polished windows, into quieter blocks where the lights dimmed and the noise softened, the contrast became clearer, sharper, undeniable, because this was the space where things were not managed, not controlled, where lives existed outside the systems he had built, and somewhere within that space she was still moving, still carrying the same quiet strength he had failed to recognize when it was standing right in front of him. And that realization did not come with clarity, it came with urgency, a growing sense that each step mattered now in a way it had not before. Because this was no longer about correcting a mistake on paper, it was about finding a person he had reduced to a decision. And as the rain began to fall more steadily, tracing lines across the pavement and catching the glow of distant streetlights, William Carter kept walking, not knowing exactly where the path would lead, only knowing that stopping was no longer an option. The rain settled into a steady rhythm, not loud, not violent, just constant, like a quiet reminder that time did not pause for hesitation. And somewhere between one block and the next, William Carter slowed, not because he wanted to, but because something in the atmosphere shifted, the city growing quieter the further he moved from the main streets, the glow of storefronts fading into dim apartment windows, the sound of traffic softening into distant echoes, and in that quiet, the urgency that had been pushing him forward began to stretch into something heavier. Something that required him to notice more than just where he was going, but what he had missed along the way, because for the first time in a long time, there was no immediate solution waiting at the end of his actions, no clear outcome guaranteed by effort alone, only the steady presence of uncertainty. And as he stepped beneath a narrow overhang to escape the rain for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air, he looked out at the empty stretch of sidewalk ahead. Water collecting in shallow pools that reflected the dull orange glow of a single streetlight, and the stillness of it all carried a weight that pressed inward, because this was where she had been, not just physically, but in a way he had never truly considered, existing in a space without insulation, without protection, without the layers of control he had always taken for granted. And the realization did not come with words, it came with absence, with the understanding that while he had been insulated behind glass and structure, she had been moving through this exact environment, navigating it without complaint, without recognition, and that contrast did not resolve easily. It lingered, stretching across every step he had taken that day, so he did not move right away, did not rush forward. Instead he stood there, listening to the rain, feeling the cold settle through his coat, allowing the moment to exist without immediately forcing it into a decision, because something about this pause mattered, something about acknowledging the gap between what he believed and what was real. And as he exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering briefly to the pavement before lifting again, he noticed a small detail just ahead, barely visible at first, a thin strip of fabric caught near the edge of the curb, damp and darkened by the rain, and he stepped closer, crouching slightly as he reached down, his fingers brushing against the material, lifting it just enough to recognize it, part of a uniform sleeve, the same shade, the same texture he had seen countless times without ever truly looking, and for a moment he held it there, the weight of it insignificant in his hand but heavy in meaning, because it confirmed something simple and undeniable. She had been here, recently, close enough that he had almost intersected with her path again without realizing it. And that proximity shifted something inside him, turning distance into immediacy, turning uncertainty into direction, and as he straightened, the rain continuing to fall around him, the city no longer felt as distant or abstract as it had before. It felt closer, more defined, as if the path he was following was narrowing into something intentional, something that required attention rather than assumption. And without hesitation this time, he moved forward again, not faster, not rushed, but with a steadiness that carried a different kind of clarity, because he was no longer searching blindly, he was following something real, something grounded. And as the streetlight flickered once more behind him, casting brief shadows across the wet pavement, William Carter stepped back into the rain, carrying with him the quiet weight of a truth that was no longer easy to ignore. The street narrowed as he moved forward, the buildings closer now, older, their windows dim and unevenly lit, and the rhythm of the rain softened against the concrete, almost like a whisper guiding him deeper into a part of the city he had never needed to understand before. And then he saw it, not immediately, not as a clear destination, but as a small shift in the stillness ahead, a faint glow spilling from the side of a low brick building, the kind of place that did not advertise itself, that did not draw attention, but existed quietly for those who needed it. And as he approached, the shape became clearer, a modest community clinic, its sign partially lit, the door slightly ajar, and something about that detail, the light still on this late, the quiet presence of people inside, aligned with the pattern he had just uncovered. So he stepped closer, pushing the door open just enough to look inside, the warmth meeting him first, followed by the soft hum of voices, low, tired, but steady. And then he saw her, seated near the far wall, her posture slightly leaned forward, her hands resting gently around a small paper cup, her coat still damp from the rain. And for a moment he did not move, did not speak, because the scene in front of him held something he had not expected, not urgency, not chaos, but calm, a quiet kind of purpose that filled the room without demanding attention. And then his eyes shifted slightly, following her line of sight, and that was when the truth settled fully into place, not as a detail on a screen, not as a line in a report, but as something real, undeniable, because across from her sat a young boy, no older than 7, wrapped in a thin blanket, his breathing steady, his expression relaxed in a way that suggested safety rather than fear. and beside him, a nurse moved quietly, checking a chart, adjusting something gently, and Ava remained there, still, present, as if the rest of the world had narrowed down to that single moment, that single responsibility, and when she finally looked up, her eyes met his. And there was no surprise in them, no panic, no immediate reaction, only a brief pause, a recognition, and then the same quiet composure he had seen earlier that day, as if his presence did not change the purpose she had come here for, and that realization struck deeper than anything else had, because it removed the last assumption he had been holding on to, the idea that her situation was something to be explained, something to be justified, when in reality it had never been about that at all. It had been about choice, about deciding where her resources, her time, her energy would go, even when it cost her something significant. And as he stepped fully into the room, the door closing softly behind him, the sound barely noticeable, the distance between them no longer measured in steps but in understanding, William Carter felt the weight of that truth settle completely, not overwhelming, not dramatic, but clear, precise, and impossible to ignore, because in that quiet space, surrounded by people who moved without recognition or reward, he was no longer the one in control of the situation. He was simply someone who had finally arrived at the point where everything he believed had to be reconsidered. The room did not change when he stepped closer. No one turned, no one paused, the quiet rhythm of care continued as if his presence carried no weight here, and for the first time in a long time, that absence of recognition did not frustrate him, it grounded him, because it made something clear that had always been hidden behind layers of status and expectation. That value here was not measured by authority or wealth, but by presence, by what you were willing to give without being asked. And as he stopped a few feet from where Ava sat, he did not speak immediately, the words he was used to relying on no longer fitting the moment, so instead he observed the way she adjusted the edge of the blanket around the boy with slow, careful movements, the way her attention remained steady, not shifting toward him until she was certain the child was comfortable, and only then did she look up again, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without defensiveness, just a quiet acknowledgement of his arrival. And that stillness between them held more meaning than anything he could have said, because it removed the distance he had once placed between them, reducing it down to something simple, two people standing in the same space, one who had acted, and one who had misunderstood. And the weight of that imbalance settled fully now, not as guilt in the dramatic sense, but as clarity, the kind that does not demand reaction but requires change. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, not carrying the sharp precision of command, but something more measured, more deliberate, as he said her name, Ava, and even that single word felt different, because it was no longer a call across hierarchy, it was recognition, direct and intentional. And she responded with a small nod, her hands still resting calmly in her lap, her posture unchanged, as if she had already accepted whatever would come next. And that acceptance shifted something again, because it revealed that she was not waiting for anything from him, not an apology, not an explanation, not even acknowledgement. She had already chosen her path without needing his response to validate it, and that realization stripped away the last layer of control he had been holding on to, leaving only the moment itself, unfiltered and immediate. So he took a step closer, closing the distance that had once defined their interaction, and for a brief second, he hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, understanding that what he said next would not fix what had already happened, would not erase the decision he had made earlier, but it could redefine what followed. And when he spoke again, the words were simple, without embellishment, without justification. He acknowledged that he had been wrong, not in a way that sought forgiveness, but in a way that recognized truth, stating that he had judged her without understanding, that he had reduced her situation to something incomplete. And as the words settled between them, the room remained unchanged. The nurse continued her work, the boy shifted slightly beneath the blanket, and Ava listened, her expression steady, absorbing what he said without interruption. And when he finished, there was no immediate response, no dramatic shift, only a quiet pause that stretched just long enough to carry meaning, before she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as acceptance, not as rejection, but as acknowledgement, the same way she had acknowledged everything else that day, with calm, with dignity, without making the moment about anything more than what it was, and in that silence, William Carter understood something he had not before, that this was not about restoring balance through action alone, it was about recognizing a kind of strength that did not need to be seen to exist, and as he stood there, the distance between who he had been that morning and who he was in that moment felt both vast and immediate, not defined by time, but by understanding, and for the first time, that shift did not feel like a loss of control, it felt like something closer to truth. The quiet in the room remained, not empty but full, carrying the weight of everything that had just been said without needing to be repeated, and as the seconds passed, nothing rushed to fill it. No sudden resolution, no immediate shift in circumstance, only the steady presence of people continuing to do what they had already chosen to do, and that was where the difference lived, not in grand gestures, not in declarations, but in the quiet consistency of action, and William Carter stood there a moment longer, allowing that understanding to settle completely, not resisting it, not trying to reshape it into something more comfortable, because for once, clarity did not need to be controlled, it needed to be accepted, and slowly, without drawing attention, he moved his gaze from Ava to the boy resting across from her, noticing the small details he would have overlooked before, the way the blanket was tucked carefully around his shoulders, the way his breathing remained even, the way the tension that might have been there had already been eased by nothing more than patience and presence, and that simplicity, that quiet effectiveness, contrasted sharply with the complexity of the world he operated in, where solutions were often layered, structured, expensive, and yet here, something essential had been provided without any of those things, and as that realization deepened, it no longer felt like a contrast, it felt like a correction, a recalibration of what truly mattered. So when he finally stepped back, creating space not out of distance but out of respect for what was already unfolding, his movements were measured, intentional. And he did not interrupt the moment again, did not attempt to take control of it. Because he understood now that this was not his moment to define, it was hers, and that understanding carried forward as he turned toward the door, the soft sound of it opening blending into the low hum of the clinic, and just before he stepped out, he paused briefly, not to speak, not to draw attention, but to look once more, not at her position, not at her role, but at her as a person he had finally begun to see clearly, and then he left, the door closing gently behind him, returning him to the quiet street where the rain had begun to ease, leaving behind a thin mist that softened the edges of everything it touched, and as he stepped out into it, the city no longer felt divided into separate worlds, it felt connected in a way he had not recognized before. Each space carrying its own form of value, its own form of strength, and as he walked back toward the brighter streets, his pace steady, his expression unchanged on the surface, something within him had shifted in a way that did not need to be displayed, because it would show itself in what came next, not in words, not in promises, but in decisions made differently, in attention